Every story has a starting point, and this one begins with a man who simply wanted to live a normal, peaceful life. Our main character is a disabled veteran who served his country with honor. After years of sacrifice, he looked forward to retirement and a quiet home where he could finally rest. Like many people, he believed that buying a house in a neighborhood with a homeowners association, HOA, would be a good decision. HOAs are supposed to keep communities safe, clean, and organized. At least, that's what the brochures promised. But things turned out very differently. From the outside, his new home looked perfect, a lovely lawn, friendly neighbors waving when he moved in, and a promise of community living where everything was neat and orderly. However, behind this picture-perfect setting, trouble was waiting. You see, the veteran was in a wheelchair. Stairs were more than just an inconvenience, they were a barrier that made daily life difficult and even dangerous. Something as simple as leaving or entering his own home became a struggle. To live with dignity and independence, he needed a wheelchair ramp. Not as a luxury, not as an optional add-on, but as a basic necessity. For him, this ramp meant freedom, the ability to go outside without waiting for someone to carry him, the ability to feel like his home truly belonged to him. When the veteran made plans to build this ramp, he didn't expect it to cause any problems. After all, it was his property, his need, and his right. He even made sure that the design was safe and professional. But he underestimated one thing: the power of HOA, Karens, those people who treat neighborhood rules like weapons and believe they can control everyone else's lives. The first sign of trouble came when HOA Karen, a woman obsessed with enforcing every minor detail of the rulebook, noticed construction starting. Instead of seeing a disabled veteran trying to make his life easier, she saw something she didn't like. To her, the ramp was an eyesore that might lower property values. She didn't care about the man's struggles, his service to the country, or his legal rights. All she cared about was controlling the neighborhood according to her personal taste. What began as a simple home improvement project soon turned into a battle. A battle not just for a ramp, but for respect, dignity, and justice. Our veteran was about to face one of the toughest fights of his life, not against enemies on the battlefield, but against a homeowners association that forgot the meaning of compassion. This introduction sets the stage for the story: a disabled man, a necessary ramp, and a ruthless HOA Karen determined to make his life miserable. But what the HOA didn't know was that this man wasn't just any homeowner. He was someone who had faced challenges far greater than them, and with the right lawyer by his side, he was ready to fight back. When the veteran first moved into the neighborhood, he felt a sense of relief and even excitement. After years of dealing with hospitals, therapy, and the daily challenges of living with a disability, he finally found a place that seemed perfect. The community looked peaceful, the houses were well kept, and the lawns were neatly trimmed. It was the kind of neighborhood where children rode their bikes on the street, dogs barked happily behind fences, and people waved when you drove by. To him, this move wasn't just about buying a house. It was about starting a new chapter. He wanted stability, comfort, and a place where he could feel safe and respected. For a veteran who had spent years in service and seen more than his fair share of hardship, this neighborhood looked like the dream he deserved. At first, everything went smoothly. A few neighbors came over to introduce themselves, bringing cookies or offering to help unpack. He felt welcomed, and for a moment, he believed the HOA was actually doing its job, creating a clean and organized environment where people could thrive. But like many HOA communities, the peace was only on the surface. Hidden under the smiles and the promises of community living was a system built on strict rules, constant surveillance, and people like Karen who thrived on controlling others. The veteran didn't notice it right away. To him, these rules seemed harmless: don't let your grass grow too long, keep your trash cans out of sight, paint your house in approved colors. Annoying, maybe, but not a big deal. It wasn't until he tried to make his house fit his needs that he saw the darker side of the HOA. The house itself was beautiful but not designed for someone in a wheelchair. The front steps were a daily obstacle, and each time he left or entered the home, he had to struggle or depend on someone else for help. For a man who valued his independence, this was humiliating. But he thought, no problem, I'll just build a ramp. It's my home, and that's a simple project. Before starting, he believed it would be no issue. After all, what neighbor would object to someone making their house safer and more accessible? In fact, he thought people might respect his determination to live independently. What he didn't realize was that this neighborhood had its own watchdog, Karen. She wasn't just any HOA board member. She was the type who treated the HOA handbook like the Bible and enjoyed policing every detail of everyone else's life. To her, rules weren't guidelines, they were weapons. And she would soon use them against him. So while the veteran was moving boxes, planning furniture, and finally enjoying the idea of a comfortable home, HOA Karen was already keeping an eye out. She saw the new neighbor in a wheelchair, she saw the possible changes to the house, and in her mind, she was already preparing to fight it. The heart of this story lies in something so simple, yet so essential, the wheelchair ramp. For the veteran, this wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival, safety, and dignity. His home had a small set of stairs leading to the front door, a design that might not matter to most people. But for him, those stairs were a daily reminder of the challenges he faced. Imagine waking up every morning and knowing that something as basic as stepping outside your front door requires effort, planning, and sometimes even help from another person. That was his reality. Each time he needed to leave the house, he had to carefully maneuver his wheelchair, balance himself, and struggle with the steps. It was exhausting, dangerous, and humiliating. Independence, the very thing he fought for as a soldier and valued most in civilian life, was slipping away because of a few steps. The solution was clear, a wheelchair ramp. Not fancy, not decorative, just functional. He wanted to be able to roll in and out of his home safely, without relying on someone to lift him or worrying about falling. For him, this ramp represented freedom, the ability to live his life without constantly depending on others. This wasn't the first time he had thought about accessibility. In fact, doctors and therapists had already encouraged him to make modifications to his home for safety. The ramp was the first and most important step. He consulted a contractor, looked into designs that met building codes, and even made sure the ramp would look clean and professional, so it wouldn't be an eyesore to anyone in the neighborhood. From his perspective, he was being responsible. He wasn't throwing together a shabby wooden board, he was investing in a well-built, safe, and ADA-compliant ramp. To him, this was no different than adding a handrail, installing smoke detectors, or putting in stronger locks on the doors. It was a safety feature, necessary and non-negotiable. But here's the key detail: to the HOA, aesthetics often matter more than humanity. In their handbook, modifications to the exterior of the house needed approval, and ramps were not specifically mentioned. To most reasonable people, that wouldn't be an issue. If something isn't in the rulebook, you apply common sense. But to Karen, this was an opportunity to exercise control. She didn't see the ramp as a necessity. She saw it as a violation. Instead of recognizing the ramp as a lifeline for someone in a wheelchair, she saw it as a structure that ruined the look of the neighborhood. In her mind, the rules, or rather, her interpretation of them, came before compassion, before law, and before basic human decency. The veteran knew the ramp was essential. What he didn't yet know was that getting it approved would turn into a war. A war not just for his safety, but for his right to live in his own home with dignity. The trouble began the very moment construction on the ramp started. The veteran had finally hired a contractor, bought the materials, and was excited to see the project take shape. For him, this ramp wasn't just a piece of wood and concrete, it was the start of independence, a chance to move freely in and out of his own home. But as soon as the workers arrived and began setting up, Karen appeared. Karen was the self-appointed watchdog of the neighborhood. Everyone knew her. She was the type who walked around with a clipboard, measuring people's lawns, noting down which trash bins were left out too long, and reporting the smallest violations to the HOA board. While most neighbors tried to avoid her, the veteran was about to meet her head-on. When Karen saw the workers digging near the steps, she immediately stormed over. Without even asking politely, she demanded to know what they were building. When the veteran explained that it was a wheelchair ramp for his own use, her face twisted in disapproval. She didn't offer sympathy, or even a neutral response. Instead, her first words were, "That's not allowed here. You're ruining the look of the neighborhood." The veteran was stunned. He tried to calmly explain that the ramp was necessary for his safety, that he wasn't trying to break any rules, and that it would be built professionally to meet safety standards. But Karen wasn't listening. To her, the rules mattered more than his health. She insisted that no modifications could be made without HOA approval and that the ramp would bring down property values. The veteran thought it was just an unpleasant conversation and that once the HOA understood his situation, they would allow the ramp. After all, who would deny a disabled man something so basic? But Karen was already preparing her first move. Within a few days, a formal letter arrived in the mail. It was from the HOA, written in sharp, cold language. The letter said the ramp construction had to stop immediately because it violated community appearance standards. If the ramp was not removed, the HOA would begin issuing daily fines. Reading that letter felt like a punch to the gut. The veteran had faced danger and hardship in his life, but this, being told that his disability needs didn't matter, hit him in a different way. He couldn't believe that in his own home, in the country he fought for, he was being told he wasn't allowed to make it accessible for himself. The workers were forced to stop, the ramp half-finished. The veteran sat at his window, looking at the incomplete structure that was supposed to change his life. Instead of giving him freedom, it had become the start of a battle. Karen had made her first move, and the HOA had backed her. What the veteran didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The complaints would keep coming, the pressure would grow, and soon the situation would explode into a full legal war. After the first confrontation with Karen, the veteran hoped the issue would cool down. He thought maybe, once the HOA realized this was about disability access, they would back off and show some humanity. Unfortunately, he underestimated just how ruthless and stubborn HOA boards can be when they think they have power. A few days after the half-finished ramp sat outside his home, an official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. The letterhead bore the HOA's name, bold and intimidating, almost as if they were a government agency rather than a group of neighbors with clipboards. Inside was the dreaded, first warning. The letter was cold and impersonal. It stated that the ramp construction was a violation of HOA community standards, and not in compliance with approved architectural guidelines. The veteran was ordered to stop all work immediately and restore his property to its original condition. If he failed to comply, the HOA warned, he would face daily fines of $100. Fines that would continue until the ramp was removed. Reading those words, the veteran felt a mix of anger and disbelief. This wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a direct attack on his dignity and independence. He needed that ramp to live safely in his home, and here was the HOA telling him he had no right to it. The most insulting part was that nowhere in the letter did the HOA even acknowledge his disability. To them, it wasn't about his health, his safety, or his rights. It was about aesthetics and rules written in a handbook. For a moment, he considered complying just to avoid the headache. But then he thought about what that would mean. Every time he left his house, he would struggle. Every time he came home, he would risk falling. And all because a few neighbors didn't like the look of a ramp? No. That was unacceptable. Instead of tearing down the ramp, the veteran decided to push back. He called the HOA office and asked to speak with someone about the warning. But the response was dismissive. The manager simply repeated what the letter said: rules are rules. You need prior approval. Without it, you are in violation. No sympathy, no compromise, no understanding. Just a cold voice hiding behind policy. This first warning letter was more than a notice, it was a declaration of war. The HOA wasn't going to let this go. Karen had gotten exactly what she wanted, the board's official support. Now the veteran was facing not just one angry neighbor, but an entire organization determined to control his life. He folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and sat quietly for a while. Then he made a decision: if the HOA thought he would roll over and obey, they had picked the wrong man. He had faced tougher enemies before, and he wasn't about to let a homeowners association strip away his basic right to live with dignity. The battle lines were drawn, and the first warning letter was the spark that lit the fire. The first warning letter should have been the end of the matter. Any decent community board would have realized their mistake, offered an apology, and allowed the veteran to finish his ramp. But this HOA, led by Karen's relentless obsession, decided to double down. What began as a single complaint quickly grew into a campaign of harassment. At first, the HOA started sending more letters. Each one became harsher in tone, reminding the veteran of mounting fines, threatening legal action, and demanding immediate compliance. It felt less like communication from neighbors and more like intimidation from a collection agency. Every time he checked his mailbox, there was another envelope with bold, unfriendly lettering. What used to be a simple daily routine now filled him with dread. But the harassment didn't stop at paperwork. Soon, Karen and her allies began patrolling the street more often. They would stop in front of his house, point at the half-finished ramp, and shake their heads dramatically, making sure everyone in the neighborhood saw. On some days, they even took photos, claiming they needed evidence of his violation. To the veteran, it felt less like a community and more like surveillance. The most humiliating part came when the HOA decided to involve the neighbors. Instead of handling the situation quietly, Karen spread gossip that the veteran was bringing down property values and ignoring the rules everyone else had to follow. Suddenly, people who had once greeted him politely now avoided eye contact. Some even whispered when he rolled by in his wheelchair. The psychological toll grew heavier with each passing day. The veteran had fought for his country and faced real enemies, but he never expected to feel like an outsider in his own home. This wasn't the life he imagined when he moved in. The constant pressure, the letters, the stares, the gossip, was suffocating. And then came the fines. The HOA began charging him $100 per day, just as they had threatened. The balance grew quickly, hundreds, then thousands of dollars. For someone living on a modest income, it was overwhelming. The HOA hoped the financial burden would force him to cave in. But instead, it only fueled his determination. He started keeping every letter, every notice, every scrap of paper they sent him. He began documenting the harassment, writing down dates, times, and the names of people who confronted him. If Karen thought he would give up, she didn't realize she was creating a record that would one day come back to haunt her. The ramp was still unfinished, the harassment was escalating, and the veteran felt cornered. But deep inside, he made a quiet promise to himself: he wouldn't surrender. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. And this time, he wasn't just defending his ramp. He was defending his right to live with dignity, freedom, and respect. By now, the veteran had endured weeks of harassment. The letters kept coming, the fines piled up, and Karen's hostility only grew stronger. Every day he looked at the unfinished ramp and felt a painful mix of frustration and determination. He knew he couldn't give in, but fighting an HOA alone felt like an impossible task. That's when he realized he needed backup. At first, he hesitated. Lawyers cost money, and the thought of entering a legal battle against the HOA seemed exhausting. After all, he had already been through enough battles in his life. But the more the HOA pushed, the clearer it became: this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about principle. If they could bully him into giving up his basic rights, what would stop them from doing the same to someone else? So, one morning, he gathered all the letters, photos, and notes he had collected and set up a meeting with a lawyer. He found an attorney who specialized in housing rights and disability law. Someone who had experience taking on powerful HOAs. The moment the lawyer skimmed through the pile of documents, he raised an eyebrow and shook his head. This, the lawyer said firmly, is not just harassment. This is a violation of federal law. For the first time in weeks, the veteran felt a spark of hope. The lawyer explained that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and the Fair Housing Act, the HOA was legally required to allow reasonable modifications, including wheelchair ramps. Denying him this right was discrimination, plain and simple. Not only that, but the escalating fines and intimidation tactics could be considered harassment and abuse of power. The veteran listened carefully, his frustration slowly turning into resolve. He had always believed in fairness and the rule of law, and now the law was on his side. The lawyer assured him that they could not only force the HOA to allow the ramp but also hold them accountable for the stress, financial loss, and emotional damage they had caused. This was the turning point. No longer was he just a man being bullied by an overzealous HOA board. Now he was a plaintiff preparing to fight back with the full weight of the law. The lawyer began drafting letters, demanding that the HOA cease fines immediately and approve the ramp. When those demands were ignored, as Karen arrogantly believed they would be, the lawyer prepared to take the matter to court. For the veteran, seeking legal help wasn't just about getting justice. It was about reclaiming his dignity. For too long, the HOA had treated him like a problem, a nuisance to be silenced. Now, he had someone in his corner, someone who knew the system better than Karen and her clipboard ever could. That evening, as he sat by his window looking at the half-built ramp, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: relief. The HOA thought they had cornered him, but in truth, they had pushed him straight toward the very thing that would end their reign of power. The moment the lawyer filed the lawsuit, the battle officially shifted from the street to the courtroom. For weeks, the HOA had believed they held all the power. After all, they had their rulebook, their fines, and their board members to back them up. But now, they were facing something far stronger: the law. The lawsuit was straightforward but powerful. It accused the HOA of discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and the Fair Housing Act, FHA. The lawyer argued that denying the veteran a wheelchair ramp was not just unreasonable but outright illegal. He also included claims of harassment and emotional distress, pointing to the mountain of letters, fines, and intimidation tactics that the HOA had unleashed. When the HOA board received the papers, panic spread quickly. They had expected the veteran to fold under pressure. They thought the daily fines would force him to give up. But instead, they found themselves staring at a legal summons that could cost them millions. Karen, of course, was furious. She insisted the HOA had done nothing wrong and that they had every right to protect the neighborhood's appearance. But other board members weren't so confident. Some worried about their own liability, others feared the financial impact on the entire community. For the first time, cracks began to show in their united front. Meanwhile, the veteran felt a renewed sense of strength. For months, he had been on the defensive, reacting to every new letter and threat. Now, the roles had reversed. It was the HOA who had to respond, the HOA who had to justify their actions, and the HOA who had to face a judge. The legal process began with discovery. The veteran's lawyer presented a detailed collection of evidence: every warning letter, every fine notice, photographs of the unfinished ramp, even notes of Karen standing outside his house snapping pictures. Each piece painted a clear picture of relentless harassment. In contrast, the HOA struggled to defend themselves. Their entire case rested on neighborhood appearance, a flimsy argument compared to federal laws protecting disabled individuals. News of the lawsuit spread through the community. Neighbors who had once avoided the veteran began whispering about the board's behavior. Some even came forward with their own complaints about Karen and the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. What once seemed like a united community now looked divided, with many quietly rooting for the veteran to win. For the veteran, the lawsuit was more than paperwork. It was a declaration that he would not be silenced, that his rights mattered, and that no amount of fines or threats could strip him of his dignity. Every time he met with his lawyer, he grew more confident that justice was finally on his side. The HOA had wanted a fight, and now they had one. But this time, the battlefield wasn't Karen's front lawn or a stack of warning letters. The day of the courtroom battle finally arrived, and with it came a storm of emotions. For the veteran, this wasn't just another legal hearing, it was the moment his entire struggle came to a head. Dressed in his best suit, he wheeled into the courthouse with his lawyer by his side. He had faced enemies on foreign soil, but today, his fight was against neighbors who had tried to strip away his basic rights. On the other side of the aisle sat Karen and the HOA board. Karen looked smug at first, whispering to her fellow board members as if she still believed she was in control. But beneath her confidence was a flicker of nervousness. The HOA had hired their own attorney, but unlike the veteran's lawyer, who specialized in disability and housing rights, theirs was more accustomed to handling minor contract disputes. They were stepping onto a battlefield they didn't truly understand. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. The veteran's lawyer wasted no time laying out the case. He presented the letters, the fines, the threats, and the photographs. He spoke of the veteran's service, his disability, and his simple request to live safely and independently in his own home. The argument was clear: the HOA had not only harassed him but had violated federal law by denying a reasonable accommodation. When the HOA's lawyer stood to respond, the defense quickly fell apart. Their entire argument revolved around maintaining neighborhood standards and aesthetic harmony. But when pressed by the judge, they had no explanation for why a wheelchair ramp, a necessity, not a luxury, could be considered a violation. The courtroom could almost feel the weakness in their defense. Then came Karen's testimony. She insisted that she was only protecting property values, and claimed she bore no personal grudge against the veteran. But under cross-examination, her words betrayed her. When asked why she took photos outside his home, she admitted she wanted proof of non-compliance. When asked if she had ever spoken directly to him about his needs, she fumbled, finally admitting she had not. Her cold, bureaucratic attitude contrasted sharply with the veteran's heartfelt story of struggle and independence. The veteran himself was called to speak. As he described the daily difficulty of climbing stairs in his wheelchair, the humiliation of being treated like a rule breaker, and the emotional toll of constant harassment, the courtroom fell silent. His words weren't just testimony, they were a reminder of the human cost behind the HOA's rigid enforcement. Even the judge seemed moved. By the time closing arguments ended, it was clear the momentum had shifted. The HOA, once so confident in its power, looked small and defensive. Karen, who had begun the day with a smirk, now sat stone-faced, realizing the gravity of what was coming. For the veteran, the courtroom wasn't just about winning a case. The courtroom was tense as everyone waited for the judge to deliver the verdict. Weeks of filings, testimonies, and evidence had led to this very moment. For the veteran, it felt like time had slowed down. He gripped the armrest of his wheelchair, his lawyer sitting calmly beside him, while the HOA board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen sat rigid, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the judge with a defiance that had begun to crack. The judge's words came firm and deliberate. He acknowledged the veteran's service to the nation, his disability, and the undeniable need for a wheelchair ramp as a reasonable accommodation. Then came the damning conclusion: the HOA had violated both the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Their refusal to allow the ramp, their harassment, and their daily fines were not just petty neighborhood disputes, they were acts of discrimination. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Some neighbors in attendance nodded in agreement, while others sat stunned. The HOA board members looked pale, realizing their arrogance had cost them dearly. Karen's face flushed red, her smug confidence replaced by disbelief. For the first time, she had no power, no rules to hide behind, no authority to wield. Then the judge read the damages. The HOA was ordered to pay millions in compensation for emotional distress, financial loss, and punitive damages. On top of that, they were required to immediately approve the ramp and implement new policies to prevent future discrimination. It wasn't just a win for the veteran, it was a landmark ruling that would echo throughout the community. Tears welled in the veteran's eyes. For months, he had been treated as if his needs didn't matter, as if his very existence was an inconvenience. Now, the law had spoken, his rights were valid, his dignity mattered, and the HOA's reign of intimidation was over. He wasn't just a man in a wheelchair fighting an uphill battle, he was a victor who had turned the tide. His lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've set an example," he whispered. "This case will protect others too." Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered. Word of the lawsuit had spread, and the story of a disabled veteran standing up to an oppressive HOA resonated far beyond the neighborhood. Cameras flashed, microphones were raised, and the veteran spoke briefly, thanking the court for upholding justice and reminding others in similar situations never to back down. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, the victory sent shockwaves. Homeowners who had quietly resented Karen and the HOA's authoritarian tactics felt liberated. Some even approached the veteran later, offering apologies for staying silent. The board, now financially crippled and humiliated, faced pressure from the community to remove Karen from her position. For the veteran, the verdict wasn't just about the money or even the ramp. The sound of hammers and drills filled the air as workers finally began construction on the wheelchair ramp. For the veteran, watching the crew measure, cut, and secure each piece of wood was more than just a home improvement project, it was the fulfillment of a dream he had been denied for far too long. Each board placed, each nail driven in, symbolized victory, independence, and dignity. Neighbors peeked from their windows as the project took shape. Some came forward to lend a hand, offering tools or refreshments to the workers. Others, who had once stood silently while Karen and the HOA waged their war, now smiled and congratulated him. The tide had turned, the same community that once felt oppressive now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Even those who had disagreed before could not deny that this ramp was not only practical but necessary. The veteran sat nearby, watching with pride. He thought back to the countless days he had struggled with the stairs, feeling trapped and humiliated. Each time he tried to leave his home, it was an exhausting ordeal. But now, as the ramp stretched from his doorway to the sidewalk, he felt a sense of freedom return. It wasn't just wood and nails, it was a path to reclaiming his life. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be seen. After the courtroom defeat, her influence had evaporated. No one wanted to hear her complaints anymore. Her power, once fueled by fear and intimidation, had crumbled. The ramp was not only legal but now celebrated as a symbol of resilience and justice. By the end of the week, the construction was complete. The ramp stood solid and secure, blending neatly with the home's design. It was built not as an eyesore, as Karen had once claimed, but as a testament to accessibility done right. The veteran wheeled forward, feeling the smooth incline beneath him, and for the first time in years, he rolled easily into his home without assistance. The smile on his face said it all, this was freedom. Neighbors applauded as he demonstrated the ramp. Some clapped, others offered handshakes or hugs. A few even admitted they had been wrong to stay quiet during the conflict. One neighbor said softly, "This ramp isn't just yours. It's a victory for all of us against that kind of bullying." That night, as the veteran sat on his porch, looking out at the ramp lit by the warm glow of the setting sun, he reflected on his journey. He had faced intimidation, discrimination, and endless battles with a powerful HOA. But in the end, he had won. The ramp wasn't just about accessibility, it was about standing tall, even from a wheelchair, and proving that dignity could never be taken away. The ramp was more than a structure. It was a monument to perseverance, courage, and justice. And every time he used it, the veteran was reminded, this was his home, his victory, and his freedom. Once the ramp was completed and the lawsuit settled, the neighborhood entered a new chapter. For weeks, people had whispered behind closed doors, waiting to see how things would play out. But now, with the ramp standing proudly at the veteran's home, the community could no longer ignore what had happened. The reactions were mixed, some filled with admiration, others tinged with guilt, and a few still quietly bitter. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to approach the veteran with words of support. Families brought over baked goods, children waved as he passed by, and people who had avoided him during the height of the conflict now made an effort to reconnect. Many admitted they had been intimidated by Karen and the HOA, afraid to speak out against the constant stream of letters and threats. Seeing the veteran stand up, and win, gave them courage they hadn't found before. At block parties and community gatherings, the topic was unavoidable. Some praised the ramp as a symbol of progress, proof that fairness and compassion could prevail over strict rules. Others quietly criticized the HOA board for wasting so much money fighting a battle they could never win. The lawsuit had left the HOA financially shaken, and homeowners knew that dues might rise to cover the damages. This caused frustration, but instead of blaming the veteran, most directed their anger at Karen and those who had backed her. Karen herself became a shadow in the neighborhood. Once the self-appointed enforcer, she now avoided public events. Her allies on the board distanced themselves, pretending they had never fully supported her crusade. The community, once under her control, now saw her as a liability, someone whose obsession with rules nearly destroyed the very neighborhood she claimed to protect. But the most powerful reactions came from those who were inspired. Other residents with disabilities or aging parents began asking questions about their own rights. Could they add accessibility features too? Could they challenge unfair HOA decisions? The veterans' victory had planted seeds of empowerment, making people realize that rules should never come before human dignity. Local news stations covered the story, and soon the neighborhood found itself in the spotlight. Interviews with supportive neighbors highlighted how one man's courage had changed the entire community. Some residents expressed pride in living alongside him, saying he had brought honor to their street. Others admitted the ordeal had been a wake-up call, a reminder that silence in the face of injustice only enables bullies. The veteran listened to all of this with quiet humility. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man who wanted to live freely in his own home. But for the community, his struggle had been transformative. The ramp wasn't just for him anymore. It had become a symbol for everyone of what could be achieved when someone refused to back down. Karen had once been the queen of the neighborhood. With her clipboard in hand and her constant surveillance, she struck fear into homeowners who dared step out of line. For years, she thrived on controlling others, hiding behind the HOA's rules as though they were weapons crafted just for her. But after the courtroom loss, the mask of authority she had worn so proudly began to crumble. The first blow to Karen's power came from the very people she once controlled. Neighbors who had quietly tolerated her nitpicking now spoke out openly. At HOA meetings, residents demanded answers. Why had she pushed so hard against a disabled veteran? Why had she risked everyone's money on a losing battle? For once, Karen found herself on the defensive. Her excuses, that she was just protecting property values or following the rules, rang hollow. The community no longer bought into her narrative. Soon, whispers turned into petitions. Homeowners began circulating demands for her removal from the HOA board. People who had once been too afraid to challenge her were now signing their names proudly. They wanted change, and Karen was the symbol of everything wrong with the association. Financial pressure made things worse. The HOA's defeat in court left them owing millions in damages, and residents knew their dues would likely increase to cover the cost. Anger spread quickly, and Karen became the scapegoat. Neighbors who had once backed her distanced themselves, blaming her obsession with control for the entire fiasco. In their eyes, she had dragged the whole community into ruin for the sake of her pride. Karen tried to cling to her position, insisting she had done nothing wrong. But her arrogance only fueled the outrage. Attendance at HOA meetings grew, and the once intimidating boardroom now turned into a stage for Karen's public humiliation. She was shouted down, criticized, and finally voted out of her leadership role. For the first time in years, she had no authority, no power, and no one willing to defend her. Outside of the HOA, her reputation suffered too. Local media had covered the lawsuit, and Karen's name became synonymous with heartless rule enforcement. Strangers online labeled her the HOA villain, and the shame followed her everywhere. Even simple errands became uncomfortable, as neighbors whispered when she passed by. Her once proud image as the neighborhood guardian had been destroyed, replaced by the picture of a petty, cruel woman who tried to deny a veteran his basic rights. Isolated and powerless, Karen withdrew. She stopped attending gatherings, avoided neighbors, and eventually put her house up for sale. The woman who had once acted as though she owned the neighborhood now couldn't bear to live there anymore. For the veteran, Karen's downfall wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Her removal meant the neighborhood could finally breathe, free from the tyranny of one person's obsession with control. With Karen gone and the lawsuit behind them, the neighborhood entered a period of rebuilding, not just physically, but emotionally. For too long, the community had been overshadowed by fear, fines, and constant surveillance. Now, there was a chance for something better. The veterans' victory had opened everyone's eyes, and residents began to talk openly about what kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in. At the first HOA meeting after Karen's removal, the atmosphere felt different. Instead of tension and intimidation, there was cooperation. Neighbors who had avoided meetings in the past now attended with fresh energy. People who had once kept silent finally felt safe to speak. The board itself began to change, too. New members stepped forward, people who wanted fairness and transparency rather than power and control. The HOA, once a symbol of oppression, started transforming into a true service for the community. One of the first decisions made was to revise the rulebook. Outdated restrictions that prioritized appearances over people's needs were rewritten. Accessibility became a priority. Guidelines were added to ensure no resident would ever face discrimination again. For many, this wasn't just about preventing another lawsuit, it was about restoring humanity to the heart of their neighborhood. The ramp at the veterans' home became more than just a structure. It became a symbol of the new beginning. Children used it as a shortcut when riding their bikes, neighbors admired it as they walked by, and guests often pointed it out as a story of resilience. What Karen had once called an eyesore was now a point of pride, a reminder of how the community had grown stronger through struggle. Beyond rules and policies, relationships within the community began to heal. Families who had been divided by the conflict slowly came together again. Block parties, barbecues, and small gatherings returned, this time with a sense of unity that had been missing for years. The veteran was often at the center, not because he sought attention, but because his courage had inspired others to stand together. There was also a financial recovery plan. While the damages had strained the HOA's resources, residents collectively decided to manage the burden with fairness. Instead of resentment, there was acceptance. They knew the cost was the price of justice, and many saw it as an investment in a better future. The experience had taught them that blindly following authority could come at a higher cost than standing up for what's right. The new beginning wasn't perfect, but it was real. People had learned the value of compassion, the strength of unity, and the danger of unchecked power. What once felt like a community ruled by fear was now a neighborhood where people actually looked out for one another. The veteran's victory didn't just change his own street, it rippled far beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood. What started as a personal battle against unfair HOA rules grew into a story that caught the attention of local media, advocacy groups, and even lawmakers. It became clear that this wasn't only about one ramp or one man, it was about the rights of people everywhere who faced similar struggles in silence. News outlets covered the case in detail. Headlines framed it as, "Veteran wins against HOA bullying" and "Wheelchair ramp becomes symbol of justice." Reporters interviewed neighbors, legal experts, and disability advocates. The story spread across television, newspapers, and eventually online platforms where it went viral. Thousands of people shared it, leaving comments of support, outrage at the HOA's actions, and admiration for the veteran's persistence. For many, his courage became an example of what it means to fight back when the system seems stacked against you. Disability rights organizations soon took notice. They used the veteran's case as a teaching example, reminding people of their legal protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. Workshops and online guides were created to help others recognize discrimination and fight it effectively. The veteran's struggle gave strength to people in other communities who had been too afraid to stand up to HOAs, landlords, or local authorities. His ramp was no longer just his, it became a symbol of accessibility everywhere. Lawmakers also began to pay attention. Some representatives publicly condemned the HOA's actions, calling for stricter enforcement of disability laws in housing communities. Discussions emerged about updating regulations to prevent HOAs from abusing their power in similar ways. While change didn't happen overnight, the case sparked conversations in city councils and state legislatures about protecting vulnerable residents from discrimination disguised as rule enforcement. Even other HOAs took the lesson to heart. Across the state, some boards quietly reviewed their own rulebooks, removing overly strict guidelines that could lead to lawsuits. They didn't want to become the next cautionary tale splashed across the news. Ironically, what Karen once believed would protect property values ended up doing the exact opposite. Her actions damaged the HOA's reputation and forced others to reform before it was too late. On a more personal level, families reached out to the veteran with letters and emails. Parents of disabled children thanked him for showing that accessibility was worth fighting for. Elderly homeowners struggling with mobility issues found hope in his victory. His fight gave them a sense of validation. Proof that they didn't have to settle for humiliation or struggle in their own homes. After the noise of the courtroom battles, the angry HOA meetings, and the media attention had settled, the veteran finally had time to pause. For the first time in years, his home truly felt like a sanctuary. The ramp stood strong at his front door, not just as a physical structure, but as a monument to everything he had endured. And in that quiet, he began to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He thought back to the first day he moved in, full of hope, believing he had found a peaceful neighborhood to spend his retirement. At the time, he never imagined a simple request for accessibility would spiral into such a storm. Yet, in hindsight, he realized it was always about more than a ramp. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to live freely in one's own home without shame or barriers. The veteran reflected on his time in service. On the battlefield, he had fought for freedom, not just his own but for countless others. And here at home, years later, he had been forced to fight again, this time not against a foreign enemy, but against prejudice, ignorance, and blind bureaucracy. The irony was not lost on him. The greatest battle of his later life had been fought not with weapons, but with persistence, patience, and the law. He also thought about the toll the fight had taken. There were sleepless nights filled with anxiety, moments when he doubted himself, and times when he wondered if it would have been easier just to give up. But every time he faced doubt, he remembered the faces of fellow veterans who had endured far worse and the promise he had made to himself never to surrender. That promise carried him through the darkest parts of the struggle. What gave him peace now was knowing his fight had mattered. Neighbors who once avoided him now respected him. Families in other communities had been inspired by his story. And perhaps most importantly, future residents in his own neighborhood would never face the same injustice again. His battle had paved the way for others to live with dignity. But his reflection wasn't only about victory. He also thought about forgiveness. While he could never condone what Karen and the HOA had done, he chose not to let bitterness consume him. Anger might have fueled his determination in the beginning, but in the end, it was resilience and hope that carried him forward. Letting go of hate was his way of truly winning. Looking out at his ramp, he didn't see wood and nails. He saw freedom. He saw independence. He saw a reminder that no one should ever have to beg for basic human rights. And with that, he felt a calmness he hadn't felt in years, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had fought his last battle and emerged with honor intact. The veteran's reflection was simple yet powerful. He hadn't just won a case. He had reclaimed his life. Long after the dust settled, the veteran's case continued to leave its mark. It wasn't just a personal victory or a neighborhood dispute, it became a legacy that influenced how people, communities, and even institutions thought about fairness, accessibility, and human dignity. The most immediate legacy was felt within the neighborhood itself. The ramp, once a source of bitter conflict, turned into a landmark. New families moving in often heard the story from neighbors, how one man stood his ground against an overreaching HOA and won. Parents pointed it out to their children as a lesson in courage, and older residents saw it as proof that standing together could change things. What had once been called an eyesore by Karen was now spoken of with pride. Beyond the neighborhood, the case was frequently cited by advocacy groups. Disability rights organizations used it as an example of how the law could be a powerful tool for justice. Seminars, blogs, and workshops referenced the lawsuit, reminding people that accessibility wasn't optional, it was a right protected by law. For many, the veteran's story gave them the confidence to challenge discrimination in their own communities. Law students, too, studied the case. Professors brought it up in classrooms when teaching about the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. The legal documents, arguments, and verdict were used as a practical example of how real lives are affected by policies and regulations. In this way, the veterans' fight became part of the education of future lawyers who would go on to fight their own battles for justice. The HOA world also changed. News of the lawsuit spread far enough that many HOAs across the state began reviewing their own bylaws. Board members realized that what happened in one small neighborhood could happen anywhere. They didn't want to face costly lawsuits or public humiliation. As a result, some HOAs voluntarily updated their rules to make them more inclusive, ensuring they would never repeat Karen's mistakes. Ironically, the same system that had once been used to oppress the veteran was now being reshaped in response to his victory. Perhaps the most profound legacy, though, was personal. The veteran's story became a beacon of hope for individuals who often felt powerless. Veterans, seniors, and people with disabilities wrote letters thanking him for his courage. Families shared his story at dinner tables, using it to teach lessons about persistence and justice. His name became associated with resilience, a reminder that one voice, if strong enough, could inspire countless others. And so, the legacy of the case was more than legal documents and headlines. It was the ripple effect of one man's determination, spreading outward and touching lives he would never even meet. When the veteran's case first entered the courtroom, it was just another local dispute between a homeowner and an HOA. But the story quickly caught the attention of the media, and soon, it grew into something much bigger. Reporters saw the drama, a disabled veteran fighting for his basic right to access his own home, and recognized it as a powerful story of injustice and perseverance. The local news was the first to break the story. Their headline was simple but striking: Veteran battles HOA over wheelchair ramp. The image of the veteran sitting in his wheelchair beside the unfinished ramp spread across TV screens and newspapers. For viewers, it wasn't just about rules or fines, it was about compassion. People were outraged that someone who had served his country was being treated this way in his own neighborhood. As the case progressed, regional and even national outlets picked it up. News anchors framed it as a modern-day David versus Goliath story. On one side was a single veteran, fighting not with weapons but with dignity and determination. On the other side was an HOA, notorious in the public imagination for being petty, controlling, and power-hungry. The narrative wrote itself. Public opinion quickly turned against the HOA. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting the veteran. Thousands of comments poured in, "Shame on that HOA, this man deserves better, accessibility is a right, not a privilege." Strangers sent messages of encouragement, and some even offered to help pay legal fees. What began as an isolated conflict became a movement, with ordinary people uniting around the cause. For the HOA, the publicity was a nightmare. Board members who once stood proudly beside their rules now found themselves hiding from cameras. Karen, once confident and smug, became the face of cruelty in online forums and memes. Her attempts to defend herself only made things worse. Every statement sounded heartless compared to the veteran's quiet dignity. Meanwhile, disability rights groups capitalized on the attention. They used the media coverage to educate the public about accessibility laws and the struggles people with disabilities face every day. The veterans' ramp became a symbol in advocacy campaigns, proving that even small battles could ignite national conversations. Talk shows and radio stations also picked up the story. Some invited legal experts to explain why the HOA was in the wrong, while others focused on the moral outrage. For weeks, the veterans' case was everywhere, sparking debates not just about HOAs, but about fairness, respect, and what kind of society people wanted to live in. By the time the verdict came down, the veteran wasn't just a homeowner fighting for his rights, he was a public hero. His case had shifted opinions, embarrassed powerful organizations, and given a voice to countless people who had long felt ignored. When the judge delivered the verdict, the impact on the HOA went far beyond embarrassment or bad publicity. It hit them where it hurt the most, their finances. What began as a petty attempt to block a veteran's wheelchair ramp ended up costing the association more money than they could have ever imagined. The court ordered the HOA to pay a significant sum in damages. These damages weren't just a token gesture, they reflected the emotional distress, legal harassment, and discrimination the veteran had endured. On top of that, the HOA was also forced to cover the veteran's legal fees, which had piled up over months of back-and-forth hearings, filings, and expert testimony. It was a staggering figure, far higher than anyone on the board had anticipated when they first sent that warning letter. But the financial pain didn't stop there. The HOA had to pay for its own defense as well, and those legal costs alone drained much of their reserve fund. What should have been money set aside for neighborhood improvements, like landscaping, playground repairs, or road maintenance, was instead burned away in a losing battle fueled by Karen's stubbornness. As the news spread, homeowners in the community grew furious. Every resident knew that HOA funds came directly from their pockets through monthly dues. In other words, Karen's crusade against the ramp had cost everyone. Instead of spending their fees on services that improved property values, their money was wasted fighting an unwinnable case. The HOA tried to explain it as necessary enforcement of community standards, but nobody was buying it. Soon, the HOA faced another blow: insurance complications. Many associations carry liability insurance to protect against lawsuits, but insurers are not eager to pay for cases involving clear violations of federal law. In this case, because the HOA had knowingly discriminated against a disabled resident, their insurance company refused to cover all the damages. That left the HOA scrambling to come up with the money directly from community funds. To cover the financial hole, the board announced an increase in dues and a special assessment, a one-time extra payment required from all homeowners. That was the breaking point. Neighbors who had once ignored Karen's antics now openly turned against her. Some even threatened to sue the HOA board for mismanagement. Homeowners' meetings grew heated, with shouting matches and calls for Karen's resignation. The financial consequences rippled beyond the neighborhood too. Real estate agents reported that potential buyers were wary of moving into a community with such a toxic HOA reputation. Property values dipped, not because of the ramp, but because of the lawsuit and the board's reckless decisions. Ironically, the very thing Karen had claimed to be protecting. Home values was the first casualty of her campaign. In the end, the story of the veteran and his wheelchair ramp was never just about one man versus an HOA. It was about something far greater, the principle that everyone has the right to live with dignity, respect, and independence, no matter their circumstances. The veteran's journey proved that standing up for what's right isn't easy. It meant sleepless nights, endless paperwork, and painful confrontations with neighbors who should have been allies instead of adversaries. At times, the fight seemed overwhelming. But by refusing to give in, he showed that courage doesn't always wear a uniform, it sometimes takes the form of persistence in the face of unfair rules and cold bureaucracy. His story also carried a message for every community: rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. HOAs may claim their purpose is to protect property values or maintain harmony, but when those rules strip away compassion and common sense, they lose their legitimacy. A community isn't built by strict regulations, it's built by empathy, understanding, and respect for each member's needs. The veteran's victory reminded everyone that true strength lies in protecting the vulnerable, not in punishing them. For other homeowners watching, the case was a wake-up call. Many realized they too had stayed silent when unfair decisions were made in their neighborhoods. The veteran's determination became an example that silence allows injustice to grow, while even one strong voice can bring change. His ramp was not just a structure at the front of his home, it became a symbol of resistance, freedom, and resilience. The broader lesson was clear: never underestimate the power of one individual to challenge an entire system. The HOA had money, lawyers, and authority on its side, yet it was humbled by the willpower of a single man who refused to be silenced. His story reminded people that laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act exist for a reason, and they only work when individuals are brave enough to invoke them. In reflecting on his journey, the veteran often said he didn't want fame or attention. All he wanted was to live in peace. But by standing firm, he achieved something greater: he gave countless others the strength to stand up too. Veterans, seniors, and people with disabilities across the country looked at his story and thought, if he can fight, so can I. So, the final message of this story is simple yet powerful: injustice thrives when people remain silent, but it crumbles when even one person chooses to resist. Standing up for what's right may be difficult, it may be lonely, and it may even be costly, but in the end, it is always worth it. The veteran didn't just win a case. He left behind a lesson for us all: when you fight for justice, you don't just change your own life. You inspire others, and that ripple can transform entire communities.